It all started with him. I had never believed in fate or destiny until the day I met Daniel. He wasn't like anyone I had ever known. Confident yet kind, serious yet warm. It was as if life had carefully crafted him to appear when I needed him most. When my world was crumbling under the weight of my mother's illness, my father's distant demeanor, and the struggle to keep myself afloat, Daniel arrived like a steady hand on my shoulder. We met at a small art exhibition I attended to clear my head. My paintings, my passion, and once my escape, had felt lifeless for months. But he stood there in the gallery, admiring one of my older works that had somehow made its way into the collection. A soft smile tugged at his lips as he turned to me. "This is beautiful. There's so much pain here, but also hope," he said, his voice rich and steady. "Thank you," I replied, slightly caught off guard. "It's one of mine." His eyes lit up. "You're the artist? That's incredible." "I'm Daniel." "Clara," I said, shaking his outstretched hand. His grip was firm yet gentle, and for reasons I couldn't quite explain, it felt safe. From that moment on, Daniel became a constant presence in my life. He had this uncanny ability to make me laugh even on my darkest days. He encouraged me to start painting again, reminding me why I fell in love with art in the first place. Over time, he became more than just my rock. He became my everything. When he proposed after 2 years of being together, I didn't hesitate. Under a starlit sky at our favorite lakeside spot, he knelt down with a ring in his hand and a soft smile on his face. "Clara," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me what it means to truly love and be loved. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred my vision as I nodded. "Yes, Daniel. Yes." The days that followed were a whirlwind of excitement and planning. My mother, though still frail, smiled brighter than I'd seen in years when I told her the news. My father, ever the stoic figure, patted Daniel on the back and offered his approval in a way only he could, quiet but firm. "You've made a fine choice," he told me later, his voice tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Life felt perfect, almost too perfect. And then the cracks began to show. It started innocently enough. A forgotten folder of documents Daniel had left at my apartment. I was tidying up when I noticed it tucked under the corner of the couch. Curious, I opened it, expecting work-related papers. Instead, I found an old photograph of a woman I didn't recognize. Her face strikingly familiar in a way I couldn't pinpoint. She stood arm in arm with a man who bore a resemblance to my father. The air left my lungs as I turned the photo over. Scrawled on the back in neat handwriting were the words, "Elena and David, 1992. David, my father's name." My hand shook as I searched the folder for more. There were letters, intimate, passionate letters exchanged between this Elena and my father. Each one felt like a dagger to my heart. I couldn't believe what I was reading. My father, the man I had always seen as a pillar of integrity, had been unfaithful. Worse, the dates suggested this affair had taken place during my early childhood, a time when I had naively believed we were a happy family. The walls seemed to close in around me as my mind raced. Why did Daniel have these? Who was Elena to him? Questions spiraled uncontrollably, each one more alarming than the last. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps Daniel had stumbled across these documents by chance. Perhaps he didn't even know their significance. But deep down, I knew better. The careful way the folder had been tucked away suggested otherwise. When Daniel returned later that evening, I confronted him. "What's this?" I asked, holding up the photograph. My voice trembled despite my efforts to stay calm. He froze for a moment, his usual composure faltering. "Clara, I can explain." "Explain what?" "That my father had an affair? That he betrayed my mother." My voice cracked and I hated how vulnerable I sounded. "Why do you have this?" Daniel stepped closer, his expression softening. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I was going to tell you, I swear." "Tell me what?" I demanded. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Elena. She was my mother." The room spun as his words sank in. My knees gave out, and I stumbled back onto the couch. "No. No, that's not possible." "I didn't know either," he said quickly, his voice filled with urgency. "Not until recently. My mother passed away when I was a teenager, and I never knew who my father was. It wasn't until I started looking into it that I found out about this. His hand gestured toward the folder on the table, the evidence of our parents' tangled past. So what does this mean? I whispered, my voice barely audible. We're... No, Daniel interrupted, shaking his head. We're not related.
Ive checked, Clara.
I made sure. His words offered little comfort. Even if we weren't blood relatives, the revelation cast a dark shadow over everything we'd built together. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, tears streaming down my face. Because I didn't want to lose you, he admitted, his voice breaking. I was terrified of what this would do to us. To you. I stared at him, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to feel. Betrayal, confusion, and heartbreak collided within me, leaving me utterly shattered. In that moment, the man I had once seen as my savior felt like a stranger. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of that photograph burned in my mind. Elena and my father, smiling as if the world belonged to them. I tossed and turned, replaying Daniel's words over and over. He had known. He had kept this from me. But it wasn't just the secret that haunted me. It was the thought that the man I loved, the one I was about to marry, was tied to a part of my father's life I had never known existed. Morning came far too quickly, bringing no clarity, only exhaustion and a throbbing ache in my chest. Daniel was still asleep when I quietly got dressed, grabbed my keys, and left. I needed to clear my head, to think. But above all, I needed answers. There was only one person who could give them to me. My father was in his study when I arrived. He looked up from his desk, surprised but pleased to see me. Clara, what are you doing here so early? Is everything all right? His voice was steady, comforting even, but now it felt like a mask. I stood in the doorway, gripping the photograph in my hand like a lifeline. Who is she? Asked, my voice trembling. His brow furrowed in confusion. Who is who? Elena, I said, holding up the photo. The color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like he might deny it. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy sigh. Where did you find that? He asked, his tone cautious. It doesn't matter, I snapped. What matters is that you tell me the truth. Who was she, and what was she to you? He motioned for me to sit, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I needed the space between us, the distance to keep myself together. Finally, he spoke. Elena was someone I cared about deeply, he began. It was a long time ago, before your mother got sick. We met through work. She was vibrant, full of life. It was wrong, Clara, I know that. But at the time I told myself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything. Except it did. My throat tightened as I listened. This was the man I had idolized. The man who had always seemed so steady, so sure. And Daniel? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Did you know about him? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I had my answer. I suspected. He admitted finally. Elena never told me outright, but the timing. It was possible. I thought about reaching out after she passed, but by then he was already a teenager. I didn't want to disrupt his life. I wanted to scream, to throw something, but all I could do was stand there shaking. You didn't think I deserved to know? That mom deserved to know. It would have destroyed her, he said quietly. And you? I made a choice to protect our family, even if it wasn't the right one. Protect us. I repeated, my voice rising. By lying to us? By pretending none of this happened? Do you even realize what you've done? His eyes met mine, filled with a sorrow that only made me angrier. I'm sorry, Clara. I truly am. But I can't change the past. I stormed out before he could say anything else, the photo still clenched tightly in my hand. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, heartbreak. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to process everything. Eventually, I found myself parked outside my apartment. Daniel's car was gone, and for a moment I was relieved. I needed time to figure out what I was going to say to him, if I could say anything at all. When I finally stepped inside, I noticed something strange. The folder with the photograph and letters was gone. Panic surged through me as I searched the apartment, but there was no sign of it. I tried calling Daniel, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Something didn't feel right. Later that evening, he returned, his expression unreadable. "Where were you?" I demanded, crossing my arms over my chest. "Work," he said simply. But his tone was off, too calm, too measured. "Why? Did something happen?" "You know exactly what happened," I shot back. "The folder is missing. Did you take it?" He didn't answer immediately, and the silence was deafening. Finally he sighed. "Yes, I took it. Clara, those things shouldn't be here. They're only going to hurt you." "Hurt me?" I laughed bitterly. "Do you have any idea how hurt I already am? You lied to me, Daniel. You knew about my father, about Elena, and you didn't tell me. How am I supposed to trust you now?" "I didn't lie," he said, his voice rising. "I kept it from you because I didn't want to lose you. I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "From what? The truth? Or from you?" He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes that scared me. It wasn't love or regret. It was calculation. "Clara," he said, stepping closer. "You don't understand. This is bigger than us. Your family. Your father. They've done things you don't know about." "What are you talking about?" I asked, backing away. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "Your father isn't the man you think he is. Elena wasn't just some affair. She was a victim, Clara. He used her, just like he's used everyone else to get what he wants. And now he's trying to cover it up." I shook my head, refusing to believe him.
No.
"That's not true." "It is," he said firmly. "I didn't come into your life by accident, Clara. I came to expose the truth." The room seemed to tilt as his words sank in. "What? What are you saying?" "I'm saying your father ruined my mother's life," he said, his voice cold and steady. "And now I'm going to ruin his." It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about Daniel, about us, was a lie. I stared at him, my heart breaking all over again. Was any of it real? I whispered, "Did you ever love me?" He didn't answer, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. I spent the night at my mother's house, too drained to go back to my apartment, too shaken to face Daniel again. Sleep was elusive, and when it did come, it was filled with fragmented dreams. My father, Daniel, and Elena, their faces blurred, their voices overlapping with accusations and apologies that made no sense. By the time the sun rose, I was no closer to understanding how everything had unraveled so quickly. Over breakfast, my mother watched me with quiet concern. She didn't press for details, knowing I would share when I was ready, but her presence was steadying, a reminder that not everything in my life was a lie. By mid-morning, I had mustered the courage to confront my father again. He deserved to explain himself fully this time, and I needed the truth no matter how much it hurt. When I arrived at his office, he was sitting at his desk, reviewing papers with a furrowed brow. He looked up as I entered, his face lighting up briefly before his expression shifted to one of apprehension. "Clara," he said, setting the papers aside. "I wasn't expecting you. We need to talk," I said, closing the door behind me. "And this time, I need you to be completely honest with me." He nodded, gesturing for me to sit, but I remained standing, arms crossed tightly over my chest. "All right," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What do you want to know?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Why didn't you tell me about Elena? About Daniel? You've had years to come clean, and yet you chose to keep it all buried. Why?" His gaze dropped to his hands, and he was silent for a moment before he began to speak. "Clara, you have to understand, I was trying to protect you. Your mother, our family. Elena was a mistake, a lapse in judgment that I regretted deeply. When I realized she might have had my child, I was terrified. But by then it was too late to fix anything. Your mother was battling her illness, and I couldn't bring more chaos into our lives. So you just pretended it never happened?" I asked, my voice sharp. "You let Daniel grow up without a father, without any acknowledgement from you, and you thought that was okay?" "No," he said firmly. And when Elena passed, it felt like the door had closed, like there was no way to make things right. "And now?" I asked, my voice trembling. Do you still think there's no way to make things right? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with regret. I want to fix this, Clara. I do. But I don't know where to start. I shook my head, the weight of his words pressing down on me. It's not just about fixing things, Dad. It's about accountability. About facing the consequences of your actions. You can't keep running from the truth. He nodded slowly, his expression somber. You're right. I've made mistakes, big ones, and I need to take responsibility for them. But Clara, you have to believe me when I say I never meant to hurt you or Daniel. I thought I was doing the right thing, even if it was the wrong way to go about it. I wanted to believe him, but the cracks in my trust were too deep. It's not just about what you've done, Dad. It's about what Daniel's done, too. He's been lying to me, manipulating me, all because of you. He wanted revenge, and I was caught in the middle. My father's face darkened, his jaw tightening. Revenge? Clara, what are you talking about? I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Daniel. He blames you for what happened to Elena. He thinks you ruined her life. And he came into mine to get back at you. My father's eyes widened in shock. And for a moment he looked genuinely alarmed. Clara, I had no idea. I didn't know he felt that way. Of course. You didn't, I said bitterly. You didn't know because you didn't care enough to find out. You abandoned him, Dad. You left him to deal with all of this on his own. His face fell. And for the first time, I saw something break in him. You're right, he said quietly. I failed him. I failed you. And now, I'm paying the price. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't all his fault. But another part of me, the part that had been betrayed, manipulated, and hurt, couldn't find the strength to offer forgiveness. Not yet. When I left his office, my head was spinning with everything he had said. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. All I knew was that I needed space to think, to process everything. But as I stepped outside, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. We need to talk. Please, Clara. Let me explain. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. A part of me wanted to ignore him, to shut him out of my life for good. But another part of me, the part that still loved him, despite everything, needed to hear what he had to say. I texted back, fine. Meet me at the park in an hour. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, sitting on a bench beneath the shade of an old oak tree. He stood as I approached, his expression tense but hopeful. Clara, he said, his voice soft. Thank you for coming. Don't thank me, I said, crossing my arms. I'm only here because I need answers. And I want the truth this time, Daniel. All of it. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. You deserve that. And I'm sorry, Clara. For everything. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why did you? I asked, my voice cracking. Why did you come into my life if you knew it would end like this? I came into your life because I wanted to understand your father, he said. I wanted to see if he was the man I thought he was. The man who abandoned my mother, who left us to struggle while he lived his perfect life. But when I got to know you, everything changed. You're nothing like him, Clara. You're kind and compassionate, and I fell in love with you. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. You can't just say that and expect everything to be okay. You lied to me, Daniel. You used me. I know, he said, his voice breaking. And I'll never forgive myself for that. But Clara, you have to believe me. I never meant to fall in love with you. That wasn't part of the plan. Stop saying that, I said, my voice rising. Stop acting like any of this was out of your control. You made choices, Daniel. You chose to hurt me. He nodded, his expression filled with remorse. You're right. I did. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave him and my father behind and start fresh. But another part of me, the part that still loved him despite everything, hesitated. I stood in the park, the autumn breeze whispering through the trees, carrying with it the weight of Daniel's words. His confession hung in the air between us, raw and unyielding, as if daring me to respond. But what was there to say? Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to walk away from him, from this chaos, from the unbearable betrayal. And yet I stayed rooted in place. torn between love and anger, hope and despair. Do you think saying sorry fixes everything? I asked, my voice trembling. Do you think it erases all the lies, all the manipulation, all the pain? No, Daniel said, his voice breaking. I don't think it fixes anything. But it's the truth, Clara. I am sorry. More than I can ever put into words. I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why did you? My voice cracked and I hated how small and vulnerable I sounded. Why did you do this to me, Daniel? If you loved me, why didn't you stop? Why didn't you tell me the truth? He ran a hand through his hair, his face etched with regret. Because I was afraid. I was afraid of losing you, afraid of what you'd think of me, of the truth. I thought I could keep it buried, that I could be with you and leave the past behind. But the past doesn't stay buried, Clara. It comes back no matter how much you want to escape it. His words cut deep because they echoed my own fears, my own struggles. The truth had a way of unraveling even the strongest of foundations, and ours had already been built on sand. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? I asked, tears streaming down my face. You've taken everything I thought was real and turned it into a lie. I don't even know who I am anymore. Was any of it real, Daniel? Or was it all just part of your plan? It was real, he said urgently, stepping closer. Every moment with you was real, Clara. I love you. I've always loved you. That wasn't a lie. I shook my head, stepping back. Love isn't supposed to feel like this. It's not supposed to hurt this much. He looked at me. His eyes filled with a desperation that mirrored my own turmoil. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've broken your trust in ways that can't be repaired. But I need you to know that I never wanted this. I never wanted to lose you. His words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity, but they weren't enough. They couldn't be. Love alone couldn't erase the betrayal, the lies, the pain he had caused. I can't do this, Daniel, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't keep holding on to something that's tearing me apart. He looked like he wanted to argue, to plead, but he must have seen the finality in my eyes because he nodded slowly. I understand, he said quietly. But please, Clara, if you ever need me, I'll be here. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I turned and walked away, the sound of my footsteps mingling with the rustling leaves. Each step feeling heavier than the last. My chest felt hollow, as if I had left a piece of myself behind in that park. The days that followed were a blur. I threw myself into work, avoiding calls from Daniel, from my father, from anyone who reminded me of the tangled mess my life had become. My mother checked in on me often, her quiet presence a balm for my fractured heart. But even she knew there was only so much she could do. Eventually, I knew I had to face my father again. The unresolved tension between us weighed on me like an anchor, and I couldn't move forward until I confronted it. When I arrived at his house, he greeted me with a tentative smile, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and trepidation. Clara, he said, stepping aside to let me in. I wasn't sure if you'd come. I wasn't sure either, I admitted, setting my coat on the back of a chair. But we need to talk. He nodded, leading me into the living room. We sat across from each other, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began, his voice heavy. About accountability, about facing the consequences of my actions. You're right, Clara. I've spent too much of my life running from the truth, and it's time I stopped. I studied his face, searching for signs of sincerity. What are you going to do? He took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I've reached out to Daniel. I told him I want to talk, to make amends. I don't know if he'll agree, but I have to try. I can't undo the past, but I can try to make things right moving forward. The mention of Daniel's name sent a pang through my chest, but I pushed it aside. And what about us? I asked. What happens to our family? His eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw just how much he had been carrying. I don't know, he admitted. But I love you, Clara, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn back your trust, to be the father you deserve. And maybe that was all we could hope for, a start. As I left his house, I felt a strange sense of relief. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least I wasn't walking it alone. My family was fractured. My heart was bruised, but there was still hope, Still a chance for healing. A week later, I received a letter from Daniel. It was short, just a few lines, but it carried the weight of everything he couldn't say in person. Clara, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm trying. Your father and I have started talking, and while it's not easy, it's a step. I'll always love you, but I know I have to let you go. You deserve happiness, Clara, even if it's not with me. Daniel. Tears blurred my vision as I read the words, a bittersweet ache settling in my chest. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. A chance to rebuild, to heal, to find myself again. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.